Well, welcome everyone to another evening of church history. Thank you all for being here. Let's say a quick prayer and then we will get into the lecture. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for today. Thank you for each person who could be here tonight. Lord, I ask you to be with those who could not be here tonight for whatever reason. And Lord, I just pray that you would carve out time for each one to be able to review and study. And Lord, just make connections that only you can make in their lives. And ultimately, Lord, we just pray that the time that we're putting in and the fellowship that we're having with one another, Lord, that it would just glorify your name and further your kingdom. We thank you again so much for your presence. And it's in your name we pray. Amen. Well, tonight, we sort of touched on this a little bit during the last lecture, but we did not get very far. It's this idea of the decline of the papacy. And the first thing I want to say about this is that the fact that I'm calling it the decline of the papacy, that is not meant to be a derogatory phrase or a something to say that we are trying to attack the Catholic Church, because that's not at all what happened. This is a review and an overview of what has happened in history. And up to this point, and actually a little bit earlier than this, up to the point of Innocent coming in and becoming Pope, the papacy had done a fairly good job at maintaining itself. Some corruption had snuck in here and there, as is true with most areas of authority, but had maintained its presence, had maintained its authority and its power and the influence that it had. What we're going to be talking about tonight, and the few things that we're going to be talking about tonight, are the beginning of a precipitation event that, as we look back on history now, we can see that these events began were a turning point for the papacy, and it just from this point forward, things begin to decline as far as the papal authority, especially over the state. So don't take offense, and don't feel as though this lecture is just going to be an opportunity to come in and start bashing on one particular people group, because that is not the case. We're simply laying out what happened in history, and this is just what it is. Exactly the way that the Crusades were what they are. They're very upsetting and difficult period of time for Christianity. Very difficult for us to look back on and accept, and we just have to accept that and own that. Same is true for the things that are happening beginning around this time frame. So now that we have our mind frame set correctly, let's talk about this decline. Okay, so let's talk about, let's set a little bit of background. So I mentioned a minute ago, Innocent. Okay, remember that Pope Innocent was the very first pope who had ever been put into this position who was not a monk. Okay, he was a canon lawyer, and remember, canon means measuring rod. That was the term that was used for the scriptures. So what this means is that he was a church lawyer, right? So whenever Innocent came into the papacy, his heart was not necessarily with the people in the same way that a monk's heart would be with the people. And so his focus was much more on the rules and the law of how things should be done, when they should be done, the punishment for when they are not done, et cetera, et cetera. So, and remember, Innocent, two of the main, or I guess you could call it one main thing that he was remembered for, it's not the only thing, but one area that he was remembered for was his enforcement of the idea of excommunication, which he did not come up with. I mean, excommunications had been happening even as far back as, remember whenever we were talking earlier, whenever the persecution came heavy on the church, and there were those three people groups in Christianity that were formed, the martyrs, the confessors, and the lapsed. And then there was Novatian and Novatus and all those things that we talked about before. And they were having to deal with, what do we do about these people, the lapsed group? What do we do about these people who had denied Christ under some form of torture, or maybe under no torture at all, but then after the persecution ended, they wanted back into the church? How is the church going to handle this group of people that were apostates from the church? And so excommunication was happening even in that time. So it's not a new concept, but Pope Innocent was a very strong proponent of its utility. And so remember that excommunication is the removal of somebody from the church, an individual from the church. But what he did bring into play, and many times he's given credit for coming up with, is this term interdict, is this idea of an entire nation being excommunicated from the church instead of just an individual. And so that means if the nation is excommunicated, then all who fall under the authority of that nation are also excommunicated. So it was a huge tool of leverage, especially against those in power. So remember that Innocent was well known for utilizing those two tools at the time that he was Pope. Now, a few years later, this man Boniface became Boniface VIII. He became Pope, and he was very much in line with the way that Innocent had been doing things. He agreed with many of the ways and the ideas that Innocent was putting forth, especially this idea that the papacy has the ultimate authority. The papacy is the ultimate authority, not just over the people and not just over the various administrations of the church itself, but is also over the actual government. Like the government, the kings and whatnot should be submissive to the church. He was a very strong proponent of that. And really, throughout history up to this point, all of the popes, well, not all of them, but many of them, in trying to reestablish power, especially after this idea of Christendom came in. Remember, we talked about the Papal States and how they were given by Pippin, and this marriage, so to speak, that was formed between the church and the state, protection from the state, and the church was able to grant certain spiritual privileges or whatnot, whatever. So there was this marriage where there was mutual scratching of each other's backs. But especially after that Christendom idea took hold, the church was trying to reestablish itself as the top authority over everybody. So Boniface was no different. Okay, so Boniface is in power. Now, we have, should have put slight quotes around that. Remember, we're going to be talking about two rulers who were over these regions that are now called England and France. At this point, they're not officially formed, which is why I put the little hatch marks around them. But just for ease and understanding, because it's just the area, this was the area, and the people who lived in that area, they were under, in this case, the area of England, they were under Edward, and the area of France, they were under Philip. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so we have Edward in England and we have Philip in France. Now, these two guys are fighting with each other big time. And what are they fighting over? I did not put it up here, but they were fighting over land. Okay? They were constantly at each other and trying to advance their own authority and expand their own authority across more and more land. So they were fighting with each other quite a bit. The fighting that they were doing was militaristic and therefore had a financial burden on each of them and their relative realms, right? So the time came when each of them needed more funding. They needed to be able to come up with a way to make more money so that they could continue their campaign against one another until somebody finally won and got all the land that they were seeking. So where are they going to get this money? Well, they came up with this idea, okay, well, let's just tax the church. The church at this time is very wealthy. very wealthy. And so they're getting taxes from their own, like the bigger churches, the regional churches are getting tax money from the local churches, and then those regional churches are giving taxes or paying tribute or paying into the main church in Rome. There's all kinds of money coming in. So the people are paying, the churches are paying, and even the government at this point has some taxing that they also pay to the churches. So there's lots of money coming into the church, and it's pretty wealthy. So Philip and Edward, they look at this situation and they say, well, let's just tax the church. They've got the money, and we got to get this settled, whatever. So they send out a rule that the church now has to pay taxes, this special tax, back to the government. Well, when Philip found out about that, he was very upset. He was not into it, was not at all thinking that this was a good idea. So he put out a papal bull, this Clericus Laicos. Totally made that up. Have no idea if that's how you say it. Probably not. But this papal bull went out. And in essence, the papal bull stated, and again, this is a very simplified summary. It said, there will be an excommunication put out on anyone who does the following things. Whoever taxes clergy, so that would be these people up here, right? So whoever's actually putting out the tax and whoever's saying, yes, you owe the taxes, whoever does that, you're out. And interestingly, he flipped the coin over and said, also anyone who pays that tax without consent is also in danger of being excommunicated. So imagine how things are going. If you are a person who's already paying taxes into whatever your local church is, or if you are a church administrator and you're already collecting taxes from the people, and then turning around and paying a portion of those taxes to the main church, either in your region or the main church in Rome, and then this other tax comes out given by the government, and they're like, oh my gosh, where is this money going to come from? We're already paying what we can pay, and then all of a sudden here comes Boniface, and he puts out this papal bull, this mandate by the church that says you're excommunicated if you pay the tax. More than likely, the people were like, sweet, we don't have to pay the tax. That's good, because we're not going to worry about it. But now Edward and Philip, they're going to have to deal with that, because if the people have been told, don't worry about it, you don't have to pay the tax, and as a matter of fact, if you pay it, you're out of the church. I mean, what's the likelihood that people were paying that tax? It's not real high, right? So Edward's response to this bull, he says, all right, that's fine. Don't pay the tax. That's fine. But understand that the protection that we were offering you, wherever it is that we're giving protection, it's over. We're going to pull out, and you're on your own. You fight your own battles if you can't pay the government. And also he said, and what little bit of money we were paying into, or maybe it was a lot of money, that may have been a misspeaking, but whatever money it is that the government was paying into the church, that's over as well. If you can't pay the tax that we are mandating by law, then you're on your own as far as protection goes, and you're going to have to figure out a way to make up the deficit, because we're not going to be paying the church any more taxes. Wow. That was a major situation. So now Boniface, what is he going to do about it? How is he going to respond to all of this? Well, Boniface was between a rock and a hard place. He had already put the bull out. The statement had been made. It was already out there. He couldn't take it back. But now we have retaliation against the church by somebody who actually has leverage over the church. The church still needed protection. The church did not have a military. It did not have a way to protect itself from any people group who decided to rise up and try to come against it. And the money that they were paying in, based on what I'm about to tell you Boniface's response was, the money coming in was very likely significant. And so Boniface was suddenly in a place where he needed to make a decision. And so what he did was, he just very quietly and very softly allowed that tax to happen by the government. He did not reverse the bull. He did not, make any huge declarative statements to the people. But what he did do is, as people were, because this says without papal consent, some people were asking and he was granting. Those who weren't asking, he was just sort of turning the blind eye and just allowing the taxation to happen, because very likely these things were very important to the church at that time. Okay, so that's what's happened. That's what's happened so far. Now, several years later, there was a bishop, and it doesn't matter who it was. You can look it up if you'd like. But there was this bishop, a French from the area of France, who was arrested and imprisoned for treason. Okay, now whether or not those charges were true, that's irrelevant. This bishop was imprisoned, and Boniface found out about it, and he says, "Oh my gosh, what is the government doing, imprisoning my people, my bishop, right? Why is that happening?" Well, so Boniface's response to this man being imprisoned by the government was, release him immediately, like right now. I don't want any discussion about it. I want him released now. And he was so incensed by it, he began to enforce this papal bull that he'd kind of let slide a little bit. He began to enforce it. So here come the excommunications. Here come the words that tell the people, do not pay the taxes. And if you happen to be somebody who worked for the government, who was a churchgoer, and you were a Matthew, so to speak, you were a person who was coming in and collecting taxes, you're out of the church. Like, he started to enforce these things. Well, now that he started making or causing waves around this Frenchman, right? Well, Philip is now, what's going on? Why are you making threats against me, sort of thing? Like suddenly Philip is right in the middle of this because this bishop is a Frenchman. Well, Philip's response to this situation, he called a council of the French Parliament, okay? And this council was pretty heavily weighted in his favor. It really wasn't so much that they were anti-Boniface at this time, although some of them very likely were, but they were pro-Philip. Do you see what I'm saying? So he pulls people in of like mind, and he has this council of the French Parliament, and they decide that they've come together and they're going to decide what to do about, these demands that are being made by Boniface and this bishop that has been imprisoned and blah, blah, blah. They're going to figure out what they're going to do about it. And so the bottom line, the end of the day, what they decide is they are going to be loyal to Philip, and they are not going to be loyal to Boniface. So whatever it is that Philip wants to do about this situation, the French government, in essence, is going to back Philip. They're not going to turn on him and start backing Boniface and force his hand. So there is no allegiance to Boniface from this council. Well, Boniface finds out about this council that was called, and everyone seems to be against him, and so he issues another papal bull. This one is the Unum Sanctum. And again, the sort of washed down version, or the summary version of this, very simplified version of this bull is, it really doesn't matter what all of these countries are saying, what all these government powers are saying. The bottom line is, salvation depends on the state's submission to the papal authority. This comes all the way back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, and even back as far as Innocent. One of their main missions was to reestablish the authority of the papacy. This bull is reestablishing the authority of the papacy, and kind of in law form, or at least in church law form. And so he puts out this papal bull and says, look, this is the bottom line. The church is over the state, and the church needs to submit to the state, and you need to calm yourself, basically, and get on board and start doing what you know you need to be doing, because the church is the ultimate authority. All right, well, Philip is, not impressed. None of these people are impressed with the retaliation tactics that are going on from the people that they are in conflict with. So, what does Philip do? Well, Philip has a lawyer, very likely one of many, but he has a lawyer. His name is William of Naugaret. Now, William was well known because he was extremely good at his job. He was an excellent lawyer. He was very capable and was just able to get the result that was expected of him. Now, the other thing that he was known for is his scruples were not necessarily up to par. He was known for doing things and getting the result in any way that he needed to, and so he wasn't necessarily the most moral lawyer. So, this William of Naugaret, very likely under Philip's authority, under his, some sort of command from Philip, William got a few of his people together, and in 1303, Boniface, the Pope, was attacked, and it was by this band of people who were, if not being led by William, at least he was part of the group. He was attacked and he was beaten very, very severely, and he was taken to a city and held, the city called Agony, and he was held there for several days. Now, I've read a couple of accounts. Most of the accounts say that friends of Boniface came in and rescued him and pulled him out of the city. Some other accounts don't really give as much, they don't give you as much detail about exactly how it happened, and they'll say that he escaped the city. I am assuming his friends were the ones that helped him, but it doesn't really matter. One way or another, Boniface was removed from this situation just a few days after he had been taken and held. He left the city, but he was in terrible shape, and a few weeks later, he passed away from fever. And it was very likely and most probably from the beating that he took at the hands of William and his buddies. So now Boniface has passed away. Now, part of the reason, well, let me say it this way. The events at Agony are significant because up to this point, you hadn't had governments outside of these sort of crazy people groups like the Huns and the Vandals, and the people that just come in and kill everybody and take everything and are just sort of the scavenger sort of people. The formal governments, like, they weren't formally France and England yet, but these were civilized governments, right? This was the first time that a quote-unquote civilized government came in and attacked the church. I mean, this was a physical attack on the Pope, and therefore a physical attack on the church. And the outcome of that attack was the Pope died. This was definitely a turning point in the history of the church as far as what was going on with papal authority, because now it has been established in much the same way that we talked about earlier whenever we talked about Theodosius and we talked about Bishop Ambrose. Remember, Theodosius was the man who sent his troops into Thessalonica after a few of his Roman guards were killed during a riot, and he kind of flipped out and sent these Roman soldiers into Thessalonica and told him what he asked them to do was just wipe out the city. And after they had left, a couple days after they had left on their march toward Thessalonica, he thought, well, that probably wasn't a good idea. And so then he sends word to not do it. And so by the time the person who had the word to not kill anybody, by the time he reached Thessalonica, several thousand people had already died, right? So Bishop Ambrose was Theodosius, that was his religious authority, not impressed. And remember, he excommunicated him, and Theodosius says, whatever, I don't care. But 8 months later, he's out begging over and over again to be allowed back into the church, and how that was a turning point, because that was basically the first time that an authority figure, a state authority figure, had bent the knee and come under the authority of the church. Remember, this is much the same thing. Now we have it's just for a different reason. It's a turning point because the church, who had been, for all intents and purposes, the church had been untouchable at this point. I mean, you don't go in and mess with the people of the church. They're doing God's work. They're helping the people. They're spiritually guiding everybody. You have to be one of those, crazy people groups who have no real caring for any sort of human life, because they'll just come in and kill anybody. But these civilized people, they had respect for the church, and this was the first time that we had seen that respect had declined to the point where they attacked and ultimately led to the death of a pope. That was a major thing. So Boniface is now passed away, and a few other popes are going to come into play. And just interestingly enough, one of the next popes was Benedict XI. He was in office for only about 8 months whenever he was, and he really wanted to try to heal things. He wanted to try to bring the people back together. He wanted to try to heal things with the government. I mean, his heart was to heal and not to continue to, fight. But about 8 months into his time in office, he was given poisoned figs, and he passed away. In 1305, this man, Clement V, he becomes very important. He becomes Pope, and he is elected, or I keep saying the word elected, he was put into his position by Philip. So what does that probably mean? How did Philip gain the authority to place the Pope into office? Well, the only way that he could have done it is if he bought it. So most people agree that Philip bought the papacy. And when he did that, he did it for the sole purpose of putting in his own person into this ultimate authority. So Philip basically puts this man Clement into the papal office. So Clement is significant for several reasons. One of the reasons is he was the first Frenchman to become Pope, okay? He did something unheard of. So up to this point, all of the men who had the position of Pope lived in Rome and lived at that church in that city and governed from Rome, okay? Now, especially after this Parliament decision that went against the papacy, I mean specifically Boniface, but against the church in, sort of, so to speak, this guy Clement, being a Frenchman, he did not want to walk in and live in the midst of the Boniface lovers, basically. Boniface is gone, but his influence is still very real. People will remember him, and they loved him, and they miss him. They're appalled by what had happened to him, how he died. So this guy, being a Frenchman, did not want to be involved in the middle of that. He didn't want to walk into that. And so what he did, unheard of, what he did is he moved the office of the papacy from Rome to this French city known as Avignon. And he ruled out of that city. And I mean, that caused a huge stir. Like, what are you doing? You can't do that. But he did. And one of the first things he did after he took his position is all of the interdicts that had been put out against France, he reversed them. No more in effect. They're out of here. The other thing he did is any edicts or bulls, any rules that had been put out that were negative, that were counterproductive to France, They're out. He reversed all of them. And I'm sure that Philip had something to do with that. I'm sure that Philip said, I gave you this position, so now let's clean house and let's get this done. And this guy was more than happy to comply with that because, it was his country. He didn't want to live under those negative effects either. So now now that we've kind of set this stage, let's talk about the aftermath of moving the papacy to France, to Avignon. All right. All right, so we have Philip, who has placed Clement V into the papacy, and they're living in Avignon. Now, the next 6 popes from here all remained in Avignon. Okay, they were all elected and put into place and stayed in this city. So the office of the papacy was effectively removed from Rome and it depends on where you look, but it was a period of between, most say either 70 or 72. This is probably the most cited number, but it doesn't really matter. It's around 70 years. 70 years that the papacy was not in Rome, but in Avignon. This 70-year period is known as the Babylonian captivity of the church. So why do you suppose it was given the name of the Babylonian captivity? It was because how long were the Israelites taken into captivity by Babylon? Yeah, 70 years. So this 70-year period where the papacy was removed from Rome and taken to this area of France, they called it the Babylonian captivity because of the time frame, how similar it was to the Israelites being taken captive into Babylon. But you have to make sure that you put this phrase of the church on there. If you're talking to somebody and you're trying to relay a little bit about the history that you've learned about the church, and you say, oh yeah, and then the office of the papacy moved to France for 70 years and they called it the Babylonian captivity, anyone who has done any sort of biblical study at all is going to say, well, I thought the Babylonian captivity happened back with Israel. And they're going to think you're crazy. Like there's going to be confusion and mayhem. Just make sure that you understand that you have to say this was called the Babylonian captivity of the church. Okay? So just make sure you keep those things straight in your head, especially if you're going to start talking with people about the history of the church. So there were a lot of countries that were looking in on what had been happening, and not just the fact that it was moved. I mean, there were probably people outside of Rome, I'm sure there were, who were upset about the fact that the papacy physically moved. But more so than that, there were countries and peoples groups who were looking in on how the papacy was governing, and they were not pleased with what was happening. I mean, again, very likely Philip had control of the papacy. I mean, he was putting people in who were going to play ball with him. And so the people were looking in on this and they were saying, man, the papacy has gotten so corrupt. There's so much nepotism and so much simony and just corruption, even some sexual immorality going on inside the papacy. And the people were becoming very discontent with what was happening. But the interesting thing is there wasn't a thing anybody could do about it. They didn't like it, but the French were reigning supreme at this time. Government, church, they kind of had control of the whole shebang. So while people were not, in general, people, especially outside of the country, were not pleased with it, there really wasn't too much that they could do about it. So Some of the stuff that had come into play, there was lots of money that was coming into the church. There were these. I'm just going to give them to you. I'll write down the names, but you don't really have to memorize these things. I just want you to understand the kinds of taxes. Some of the kinds of taxes that were coming into the church. They had what was called an Ananot. They had a reservation. And then, of course, they had this indulgence, which we've talked about before. But we'll go over it again real quick. This Ananot, okay, every time a new bishop was appointed, the new bishop's first year's salary would go to the Pope. That was called the Ananot, okay? If you were a bishop who was already in place, but you were transferred from one place to another, same thing happened. They would create new Anots, and your first year's salary upon transfer would go straight to the Pope. That was what an Anot was. A reservation, basically what this means is if there was somebody who was being appointed as bishop, the Pope had the authority to delay that appointment indefinitely. He could delay it as long as he saw fit, and all the income that would be happening under that bishop or to that bishop would go straight to the Pope. So the Pope had the authority to pull in other people's salaries. Just by moving them around, he could pull in people's salaries. And then, of course, there was this indulgence. Now, remember, we haven't talked in great detail about indulgence, but let's make sure we understand what it is. An indulgence is a spiritual gift given by the church that's not really a gift. You give the church money, and in return, the church will provide a spiritual advantage to you. Like, for example, an example of an indulgence would be, at the time and even today, the Catholic Church believes that people will go to purgatory. And there are basically three people groups. You have the people group who are in line with what they should be doing and the traditions of the church, and they're just in line. And when they die, they go straight into the presence of God. On the other side, you have this people group who have nothing to do with God, who reject him, who have nothing to do with the church, and just live their lives however they're living them. And those people, when they die, they go straight to hell, and there's no stopping point. It just is what it is. This middle people group, people who, for example, maybe people who have lived the lifestyle that they're supposed to be living, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, but they're in a period of being backslidden from the church, or they're in a period of content with the church, and they die in that place. It is believed that those people would go to purgatory, and purgatory is a holding tank of sorts where it's not a pleasant place to be. It's a place of torture, and your sins that you are in at the time of your death are being burned off for a period of time, and until that period of time is complete, you're there, and then once it's done, you can go into the presence of God. Well, an example of an indulgence might be if you are a widow and your husband has passed recently, or maybe even not recently. You would come in and say, I think my husband is in purgatory. I want to shorten his time that he has to be there. And again, it was just crazy because, people will say, oh, well, he maybe based on the sin that we know of in his life or whatever, his purgatory time is 10 years, or his purgatory time is 300 years, or his purgatory time is 2 million years. Like, I'm not sure who sets those standards, but there is a time frame. And I think that it is leveled. Like, the bigger the sin, the longer the time in purgatory, which again dates all the way back to Novatian and Novatus, when they're trying to figure out how to deal with people coming back into the church who had denied Christ under persecution and torture, and they were saying, "Oh, you did very little. It'll take very little to get you back. You did a lot. It'll take a lot to get you back into the church." And so that idea of grading has stayed in the church all this time, and it has extended into this doctrine, so to speak, that is called purgatory. So as a widow, I think my husband is in purgatory, so I go to the church and say, I'd like to shorten his time. And the church says, okay, pay so much money and we'll say mass for this, for your husband, and it'll shorten his sentence. And interestingly enough, whenever people have asked, well, how do we know that that the mass worked? How do we know that it shortened the time? How do we know when they're out of purgatory? Questions like this. And honestly and truthfully, the answer is I don't know. I mean, there's no way that the authority of the church can definitively know what is happening in a realm that they're not a part of. So anyway, so this idea of indulgence. Sometimes indulgences were collected in order to repair the church. Sometimes they were collected in order to provide spiritual gift of some sort or a spiritual advantage of some sort. But this idea of indulgence. So the point is that through these things and others, lots of money was coming into the church. And these two things, I mean, realize these two things especially, and actually even this one, because someone who's outside the church wouldn't want to pay the indulgence anyway. But these things, these are taxes on the church by the church. This is not a taxation of the government. This is a taxation of the church itself on the church folk by the church authority. Okay? So there was a lot of bitterness and people becoming very disgruntled when it came to the church at this time. There was a lot of corruption that they were seeing, and they felt like what they were earning was being taken by the church. So under the guise of taxes or whatever. And so let's get back to this papacy being moved for 70 years. Okay, so at the end of this, there was a pope, and his name was, it's on here somewhere, Gregory the 11th. Okay, Gregory the 11th comes into the papacy at the end of this 70 years. Okay, he ends up moving from Avignon. He ends up going back to Rome, okay? He ends up dying in Rome. Now we have a foothold. The people who are in Rome say, okay, the Pope was here, he was living here, his authority was coming from here, and he died here. Therefore, we, in Rome, we get to choose the next pope. We are going to fill the office. And of course, they wanted to fill the office with an Italian, right? They wanted to get the papacy out of France and get it back into Italy. And so what they did, he moves back to Rome, and he dies, okay? So now a group of cardinals in Rome, they get together and they put a new pope into place, and his name is Urban. Urban VI is put into place. Now, Urban is a really harsh man. He was known for his harsh treatment of the people around him. He was not nice to the cardinals and the bishops and the various people who were there to support him. As a matter of fact, in many instances, if you read up on him, he's actually described as cruel to his people. So after he had been in the office of the papacy for not very long, you know, the people who had put him in his position, they were saying, ooh, we may have made a terrible mistake. We may have made a terrible mistake putting him in. And they begin to pull away from him a little bit as far as being his counsel, being his support, being his, you know, whatever it is that they were supposed to be doing. They did their jobs, but in general, they pulled away from him. And they began to for lack of a better word, and this is a little bit more dramatic than it needs to be, but they were abandoning him without leaving him or making any formal protest. So they've got, now while all this was going on, the French people said, well, we don't care if he died in Rome or not. France has control of the papacy. We are going to fill the papacy with our own person, right? So they did not care that that Rome was, laying claim for any reason. So while this was happening in Rome, in France, those cardinals got together and they also put a man into place as Pope who was in Avignon, and his name was Clement VIII. Okay? So Clement VIII. Clement VII. Sorry. All right. So Clement VII is put into place in France. Okay, so now this is an interesting time because we have Urban in Rome, who is the Pope, and he is in authority. He is running things the way that the Pope runs things out of Rome, right? At the same time, now we've got in France, we've got Clement VII. He's also the Pope, and he is also in authority, and he is also running things the way that they need to be run, just from a different area, a different location. Clement does not recognize Urban as Pope. Urban does not recognize Clement as Pope, right? So these guys are basically going like this to one another and saying, nope, I'm the Pope. I'm going to run the place. I'm in charge. I'm the ultimate authority. La, 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 la. I'm not listening to you. And I mean, it was just crazy. They were completely not acknowledging each other than to say, you're not the Pope, right? All right. Well, they both claim to, like I said, they both claim to be Pope. They neither acknowledged one another. They each had their own college of cardinals to help ensure their authority and their power over at least the region that they lived in. And these alliances, now this idea, this is very important, this idea of nationalism began to form. Now, even as far back as when Philip was calling his council at Parliament, that was already a form of nationalism. He was pulling his people together. We're one. We work with each other. We're family, and they aligned with one another. They were allies, and they went against this perceived enemy, which at the time was Boniface, right? So the idea of nationalism was already starting to form in various ways as the leaders of either the church or this country or that country were coming together and saying, look, I need your support. We are all one unit. We depend on each other. We need each other. We need to support each other. And so this idea of other people don't understand us. They don't live here. They don't work here. We understand us. So let's stick together. Meanwhile, over here in this region, the same thing is happening. And over here in the church, this thing is happening. So this idea of nationalism had already started taking hold. And it really started taking hold during this period when we actually had two popes in authority. This guy, even though his cardinals didn't like him very much and they were sort of pulling away from him, within the church, he was still saying, look, this is the papacy. This is Rome. This is our history. We are a people group. We need to stick together. I need your support. Same thing happening in France. I need your support. We need to squelch this uprising that's happening in Rome that's not right. Just like Rome is saying, we need to squelch this thing that's happening in France. It's not right. I'm the true Pope. Oh, no. I'm the true Pope. He is not the Pope. I'm the Pope. So this idea of let's stick together in defense or against this other people group that is threatening us, this idea of nationalism began to take hold. It's very important. So, the countries that surround, that are looking in on this, well, first of all, they're like, wow, you people are so crazy. You're out of control. But at the same time, people are like, well, I agree with this. I agree with that. I agree with that person, this pope, that country, that leader. They start taking sides. They start forming opinions and deciding who it is that they feel is more correct, right? So in the case of Rome, they started getting support from, of course, Italy, England, and what was left of what we call the empire, so the Roman Empire, so that Western front, right? Meanwhile, over in France, which is, if this is the area of Rome, this is the area of England. So in the area of France, or in the area of France and England, actually, we have the support from Scotland, which is close to this region, this area. Of course, France, that totally makes sense because look who England supports. So it's no surprise at all. Plus, I mean, this is France, but there's no surprise that England would fall on this side because they had been having problems with one another for quite some time. So the fact that France is on one side, it is not surprising at all that England would go to the other, okay, or support the other. And then all the Castile nations, the Spanish nations, they were beginning to align with France. So this idea of nationalism was taking place, and these people groups, so this had happened, and they were beginning not only to form alliances within their own people, outside of where they live, outside of the country, so to speak, that they live in, you've got these other areas that are saying, no, I think I'm going to support Urban on this. And then other people saying, no, I'm going to support Clement on this. So there began to be a drawing of lines in the sand over all of this. Riots were breaking out. There were threats of crusades starting. I mean, this was becoming an extremely serious situation. This two-pope papacy needed to be resolved. Well, we being the church, the church needed to figure out how to resolve this huge mess that had been made. So, what were they going to do? So, they did the only thing they knew how to do. A council of the church formed, and they elected or put into power a third pope, okay? His name is Alexander V. Okay, he was put into place. So now we have Pope number 1, so to speak, Pope number 2, and now we have Pope number 3. This Pope being put into place by an independent council to override what's happening with these. But what happened was no one was recognizing his authority. So now all that ended up happening from this independent council electing a pope was now we have a third pope that we're not recognizing. So neither of these guys recognized him. He didn't recognize either of these guys. They're still not recognizing each other, and everyone's claiming to be pope. So it is a huge mess. This time frame is known as, this is important, this time frame is known as the Great Papal Schism. Okay, please make sure that you separate this in your mind from the Great Schism, because remember, the Great Schism was the separation between the primary Catholic Church in 1054, when the papal bull was given at the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople by the representative from the Pope in Rome, effectively excommunicating the Eastern Church, right? So at that time that bull was given out, the Catholic Church no longer existed. And you had two branches, the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodoxy Church. That split is known as the Great Schism, okay? This whenever you have two popes, and of course this guy coming in doesn't make it any better, but these three popes being, in particular these two, but these three popes being in power at the same time, all claiming ultimate authority, all, not acknowledging the other, that is known as the Great Papal Schism, okay? So this period of time where either two or three popes are in power at the same time is known as the Great Papal Schism. Well, now the church has a bigger problem. The independent council to try to bring somebody up who would ultimately take these guys out and reestablish a single pope in authority did not work at all. You just had three men fighting with each other from different locations, okay? So the next thing that happened in 1414 to 1417, there was an ecumenical council that was called the Council of Constance. This is an exceptionally important council at this time, okay? The Council of Constance. Now, this council was called by a man who was put into authority, and his name was John the 23rd, okay? Now, he was considered a pope, but as evidenced by Alexander's placement, just putting another pope into place wasn't really going to work. They had to come up with a different angle. So this guy was known as the anti-pope. Anti-pope John the 23rd called this ecumenical council known as the Council of Constance. The point behind the council, not the only point, as we will see by the end of the lecture day, but the point behind the council was to resolve the Great Papal Schism. We've got to do something about this and get this. We are fighting within ourselves and amongst ourselves so much the church is going to deteriorate to the point where it's no longer, maybe even in existence if we're not careful. So this council was called. So by the end of this council, what ended up happening was two of the popes resigned and one was taken completely out of authority. He didn't resign, but he was taken out. So now you have all three of these popes removed. Okay, there's no more. And for the moment, this anti-pope really is in authority over the church. He was not kept in that position, and a man named Martin V ended up taking over the office of the papacy, okay? So the Council of Constance did something significant in that it was able to resolve, by the end of the council, it was able to resolve this great papal schism and get these three popes out and get back to a singular pope in authority over the church. So the council was important. Now, the question is, how, this guy was completely ineffective. How was this guy able to depose these guys whenever this guy wasn't able to do it and they weren't able to do it for each other when it was just the two of them? So how did this anti-pope John the 23rd, how did he do what he did? Very interesting. What he did was, he gave each country or each region, you can maybe even each church, that I haven't read, but that may be really more the feel of it. But he gave each nation, so to speak, a vote. Okay, not each individual church, each primary church in the nation. He gave every region or every nation, every country, whatever they were known as at the time. So France got one, England got one, Spain got one, Italy got one, that kind of thing. Each nation got one vote, right? One vote. And they could decide who was going to be the next pope by election. Unheard of. But it worked. The people came in and they each nation cast their vote, and at the end of the day, these guys were gone, and Martin V was put into the position. And he was recognized, he was given the authority, he accepted the authority, and these guys were gone. And so the Council of Constance effectively ended the Great Papal Schism. It was very interesting the way that they got back to having a single pope. All right, we don't have very much time, but I need to introduce just a couple more people. So I'm going to get rid of all this, and we're going to talk about two more guys who were instrumental in instituting or ushering in the next major event in history. Okay, so I want to talk about, first of all, this man named John Wycliffe. Now, from this point forward, we're going to start, for the most part, we're going to start defining the men that we talk about by nationality, because this, again, this nationalism, idea of nationalism is taking a very strong hold, and where you're from has a lot of influence over the people that are in that region. Where you're from has influence on when someone else looks at you, oh, they're from such and such nation. We get along with that nation, so I'll listen to him. We don't get along with that nation, so I'm not so sure that this guy is worth listening to, that sort of thing. So we're gonna start defining people and making sure we know what area of the world that they're coming from. Wycliffe was an Englishman. He was known as the morning star of the Reformation. We're going to talk about why that is as we go on. I'm just going to give you the term now, and I'll explain it to you as we get closer to the end of the lecture, which is about 5 minutes away. So John Wycliffe, he was very, very much anti-papacy. He did not agree with the way that the church was handling very, very many things, doctrinally, financially, spiritually, whatever. He was just anti-church. He spoke out openly against the doctrines of purgatory, the sale of indulgences. This will come into play later on, especially when we get closer to the time of the Reformation with Martin Luther. But there are different ways to view communion. There's consubstantiation and transubstantiation. We'll get into that later. We're not going to get into it right now. But he was a strong proponent of transubstantiation. He was against the act of confessing to a priest, and he was ultimately against the idea of the Pope having ultimate authority over not just the people, not just the government, but over Christ himself and over the Word of God. He was completely opposed to that. He felt that the church needed to get back to its grassroots and not be wealthy, but distribute that wealth and distribute spiritual guidance and just get back to more of the way that the church was in earlier times. One of the key things that John Wycliffe is known for is he translated the Latin Bible into English. Okay, very important. Now, when he did this, when the church at the time saw this translation coming out of him, they were completely opposed to it. They felt that he had no authority to interpret the Word of God, much less translate that interpretation into another language. He had no authority the church had the authority to interpret, that's it. And him not being part of the church, absolutely, they condemned that. They used phrases like he's contaminated the scriptures. The scriptures that he is translating are not good for anything. Throw them to the dogs, burn them. It is corrupt and it will poison your soul. Like, they were very much against this translation. His general response to that was, look, people learn the scriptures and understand God better when it's given in their own language. Moses heard from God in his language. Paul heard from God in his language, and they weren't the same language. So we need to hear from God too, and we can do that in an effective way if we're hearing it in our native tongue. And so he didn't care what the church had to say about it. He was more interested in disseminating the word of God and getting Jesus into the hearts of the people than he was pleasing the papal authority. So he was not well liked. Okay, so that in essence is John Wycliffe. Now these dates are kind of important just so we can keep on track with where we are and what's happening. All right, so John Wycliffe. Later on, there was another man. His name was John, or Jan. Sometimes you see it as Jan Hus. Now, Hus was... to 1415. Okay, so John Hus, he was a Czech. Oh, sorry. Spelled it like an American. Pardon me. He was a Czech. His primary belief system was that Christ is the ultimate authority over the church, and the papacy does not have authority over the scriptures. They don't have the authority to supersede, change, add into, take away from, in any way alter the scripture, right? So one of his big things that he openly spoke out about was the papacy was not over the scriptures. The scriptures ultimately have authority over the church, the papacy, and the Pope himself. He believed that only God could forgive sin. He did not believe that the church had the authority to grant remission of sin, and he spoke openly out about that. And of course, he spoke out about the sale of indulgences. And so there were a lot of things that John Hus and John Wycliffe had in common. So in general, even though there was only a couple of years, or maybe not even 2 years, about a year and a half, whatever, overlap between these two when they were both alive, John Hus was considered a follower of Wycliffe because many of the doctrine or the things that he spoke out were in agreement with Wycliffe. Now, they did not agree on everything. They didn't. But they agreed on most things. And so, in general, people already knew about John Wycliffe and had heard what he believes. And then here comes this guy, John Hus, and much of what he's saying sounds like what Wycliffe had already said. And so people would say, oh, yeah, he's a follower of Wycliffe. I mean, they basically say the same thing. All right. Wycliffe, at the end of his life, he had a series of strokes. I think he had 3, something like that. It doesn't matter. He had a few strokes, with the last stroke that he had being what ended up ultimately killing him. So his death was by stroke, okay, or natural causes, okay? Now, the other thing to know about Wycliffe that I didn't mention, I'm sorry, I'm going back to him. I'm just remembering a couple of things I want to tell you. For the most part, Wycliffe, being an Englishman, what he was saying was being contained to the area of England, for the most part, right? I mean, you just talk to the people who were there, and it spreads amongst the people who were there. But there was a point in time where the King of England married a woman from Bohemia. Whenever that marriage happened, in essence, the borders, so to speak, between England and Bohemia were opened. And, Bohemian people felt more comfortable coming into England because their person was queen, and English people felt good going into Bohemia because their English king, or the Bohemian king and the English king were married. And so they just felt more comfortable going back and forth between these things. And naturally, the things of England spread to Bohemia, just like the things of Bohemia spread to England. One of those things was John Wycliffe's teachings. It began to spread out of England, and it began to go out into other regions. Okay? Now, very quickly, So now let's get back to this Council of Constance. We already know that one of the major things that came out of the Council of Constance was they ended the Great Papal Schism, right? Okay, so now this council is happening, okay, and it happened over a period of a few years, right? So during this council, John Wycliffe, his teachings were brought into question, and the council began to go over the teachings of Wycliffe, and they determined during this council that Wycliffe is a heretic. Okay? The Council of Constance, even though John Wycliffe was already passed away, he died in 1384, the council wasn't called till 1414. So all these years later, the council is discussing the doctrines or the ideas or the writings of Wycliffe. They review them, and as a council, an ecumenical council, they decided Wycliffe is a heretic in the same way the Council of Nicaea declared Arius a heretic, right? They declared him a heretic. They even dug up his bones, reduced them, burned them to ashes, and spread his ashes in one of the rivers in France. They took all of his writings that they had access to, and they burned them at this council. So Wycliffe was not at all well received by the church at this time, and at this council was declared a heretic. Now, John Huss is alive during the time of this council, and he, being a follower of Wycliffe, he was asked to come to this council so that he can defend, debate, whatever, the teachings that he's putting out and against what the church is saying. Like, they can resolve these issues. He was promised that he would be safe by an outside entity, by a government official. They promised that he would be given he would just be in safety. He would be allowed to enter the city, address the council, and nothing would happen to him. So Huss was called to the Council of Constance, and as soon as he arrived in the city, he was arrested and in prison. He was on trial. He was immediately put on trial. And for 8 months of this time that the council was being called, he was put on trial. He was very poorly fed and nourished, and he was dehydrated. He was mistreated physically. He was kept in chains. He was separated from his friends, so he was, isolated from the people that he knew and from council. And so what do you think the end of the game was after this 8 months? I mean, what do you think happened if Wycliffe was declared a heretic and most people considered Huss a follower of Wycliffe? What do you think happened to him at the council? Well, it's exactly what you think. Huss was also declared a heretic. Okay? But Huss was alive. So what they did was they took remember I told you that the writings that they had access to that belonged to Wycliffe were burned at the Council of Constance? Well, Huss was strapped to a stake on top of those burning writings, and he was burned at the stake as a heretic at the Council of Constance. So Wycliffe died of natural causes. Huss was martyred at the Council of Constance, and he was burned at the stake. So these two guys are important because a man named Martin Luther was reading up on some of the writings of Huss, and he very much agreed with most of what Huss was talking about. And so this man, Martin Luther, who was using some of the writings from Huss as points of interest for himself, that becomes very significant because Martin Luther eventually ushers in what we now know as the Reformation. So that'll be something that we cover after the holiday. So that is Wycliffe and Huss and the Council of Constance. All right, we're running a little bit late, so let's say a quick prayer and then we will dismiss. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this time together. I thank you so much for each person who could be here tonight. And Lord, I just ask that you would carve out time. I ask that you would carve out initiative, Lord, that each person would just want to know more about you. And Lord, ultimately, again, what we want from this class and from all that we're learning from you is just to glorify your name and to further your kingdom. And we ask all of these things in your name. Amen.